Well, greetings to all of you from French-speaking Montreal in Canada. I sincerely thank the organizers of this GLAD webinar for inviting me to present the closing conference. Well, probably they keep the last things for the veterans, the elders. The title of my presentation announces a legacy. Indeed, I have reached the venerable age of 84 years and been involved for more than 45 of them in the field of talent development, commonly called, incorrectly, gifted education. Thus, I am well aware that my professional career is coming to an end. This presentation aims to pinpoint some of the main ideas that I have fought for during that period of almost 5 decades. I selected 10 themes most important to my heart, just enough to maintain a slow pace through these next 50 minutes or so. The first 4 themes focus on the DMGT, the theory of talent development that has brought me international eminence, the differentiating model of giftedness and talent. Don't ask me to pronounce it in Russian. The more practical second half will address the modalities of effective academic talent development programs. I discuss all these themes in more detail in a recently published book entitled Differentiating Giftedness from Talent, available on the Amazon website. I consider this volume as the synthesis, the Bible, of my professional productivity. Now, let's first talk about my theoretical framework, the DMGT. The most important word is differentiating, and this concept will be the subject of my first theme. You know, I chose talent development as my field of study in the late 1970s, probably before a majority of you were born. As I read the work of major thinkers in this field, I quickly discovered that I was entering a conceptually chaotic world. Here are some examples. First of all, I noticed the multiplicity of definitions for the term giftedness. This concept was, for these professionals, a real catch-all. I also observed that most scholars in gifted education ignored the term talent in their professional writings. The terms giftedness and talent, giftedness and gifted monopolized the terminology. Thirdly, scholars used the term giftedness to represent at the same time high intellectual potential and high academic achievement. In fact, the identification procedures for gifted students maintain this confusion by often combining IQ scores and the measures of academic performance in their selection process. In short, in my eyes, it was a veritable Tower of Babel. Through these readings, the idea of differentiating potentialities from achievements rapidly imposed itself. Here is a summary of my argument. My starting point is a well-known slogan: develop your full potential, as you can see. This slogan expresses a reality that we all acknowledge intuitively, namely that we all possess a diversity of potentialities that we will transform more or less completely into achievements. I chose this slogan for another very important reason. In its Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Child, the United Nations chose this message to identify the primary mission of educational institutions. Here is what Article 29 says. The education of the child shall be directed to the development of the child's personality, talents, and mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. In concrete terms, I adopted the concept of aptitude to represent the idea of potentiality. What are aptitudes? I define them as naturally developed abilities. I oppose them to competencies, which correspond to systematically developed abilities or skills. For example, intellectual aptitudes are a set of naturally developed cognitive abilities that students use daily in school as their main tool to acquire academic competencies. Higher intelligence will allow for easier and faster learning of these competencies. Aptitudes have important genetic roots, while competencies benefit significantly more from the learning environment. It is because of this genetic anchoring that I chose giftedness to represent outstanding aptitudes and reserving the term talent for outstanding competencies and skills. You are certainly aware or familiar with the phenomenon of underachievement. Underachievement corresponds to a discrepancy between expected performance, the aptitude level, and actual performance, the acquired competencies. Well, underachievement is a perfect concretization of the DMGT. It represents giftedness without talent. Now let me show you the visual summarization of the DMGT. This is the version I use in the southern hemisphere, just where Brazil and Australia are situated. But maybe you are more accustomed to the one I use in the northern hemisphere. Here it is. First, note the two differentiating poles, the aptitudes component on the left in blue and the competencies component on the right in green. These two poles anchor a central component, the developmental process through which students transform their aptitudes into competencies. These three components of the DMGT form the basic trio of the developmental dynamic. Developing one's full potential means maximizing the effectiveness of this learning process. In the case of academic talents, top right, the relevant aptitudes essentially belong to the intellectual domain at left. The DMGT has two additional components, intrapersonal and environmental catalysts, which I will introduce a bit later. They are in the middle of the figure. Let's go to the second theme. Over the course of my career, I have been interviewed dozens of times by the media in several countries. I soon discovered that journalists usually ask the same two initial questions. First, what is giftedness? And second, how many are there? My second theme aims to answer that second question. You may have noticed at the top of the DMGT figure, left and right, that I have quantified giftedness and talent. I have put a number, a percentage. The access threshold that I have chosen is the upper 10% of a reference population, both for aptitudes and for competencies. Why this choice of 10%? Well, it's a big question. I will limit myself here to 4 brief observations. You will find in my volume a complete chapter on this subject. Well, first, it is a subject that my colleagues largely leave aside. I really am the only one in gifted education to discuss this subject in detail. Yet, I believe it is a very important issue, not just because of journalist curiosity, but from a scientific as well as a practical point of view. I explain that in detail in my book. Second, there is no absolute answer, no magic number to the question, how many are there? It is the same for all the thresholds we use in our societies: speed limits, retirement age, overweight or obesity thresholds, wealth or poverty thresholds. All these thresholds are conventions. That is, they are the result of a consensus between specialists. 3, most psychologists and educators keep using a threshold of top 2% for intellectual giftedness, namely an IQ of 130 or more. It was proposed, believe it or not, a century ago. But I believe the time has come in talent development to question the elitism of this threshold, which relegates 98% of the population to oblivion. Ask yourself, are young people who learn easily and quickly really so few in number? I don't believe so. 4, it is precisely in reaction to this elitism that I have chosen a 4-tier system called MB for metric-based, with a minimum entry threshold of top 10%, the blue section at the bottom. This threshold allows me to multiply by 5, no less, the population of the gifted and talented. The other 3 levels are respectively top 1%, very or highly gifted, top 1 in 1,000, exceptionally gifted or talented, and finally, 1 in 10,000, extremely gifted or talented. It is simple, it is clear, and above all, it is generous. The third team combines the first 2 to examine the practical impact in education of the differentiation between giftedness and talent. As mentioned earlier, cognitive aptitudes are the preferred tool for acquiring academic competencies. It follows that intellectually gifted students have a better chance of acquiring an outstanding number of competencies and thus of being judged academically talented. But, as is well known, not all gifted students are talented, and vice versa. If the gifted and talented populations overlap only partially, what is the percentage of that overlap? This figure, which will come soon, here it is, shows 3 possible answers. Let's look at it more closely. The blue circles at the top represent the intellectually gifted group in an average school, labeled GI, gifted intellectually. They belong to the top 10% in terms of their IQ, which is, by the way, a very good measure of intellectual aptitudes. The red circles at the bottom represent the top 10% in terms of academic achievement. Those I call the academically talented. Together, the 2 circles represent the total population of gifted or talented students, the blue gifted and the talented red. The violet zone in the middle represents the subgroup of gifted and talented students. Recall my question about the percentage of overlap. Of all the gifted or talented people, the blue and red circles, how many are simultaneously gifted and talented, the purple or violet zone? This figure here illustrates 3 possibilities: 20% at left, 50% in the middle, 70% at right. Well, because of the strong correlation between IQ scores and school achievement, most educators spontaneously choose the 70% at right. They believe that most gifted students are also talented, but that is wrong. Indeed, research has shown that the real answer is the 20% at left. Yes. In my book, I discuss this surprising result in detail. Let's look at it more closely. Keep in mind that these two circles represent the total population of gifted and or talented students. About 40% of them are gifted but not talented. They do not achieve in the top 10% of academic achievement. They are below the top 10% threshold in talent. Another 40% belongs to the talented group at the bottom, but their cognitive aptitudes put them below the giftedness threshold of the top 10%. Thus, only the 20% purple subgroup of these gifted or talented students can be simultaneously labeled gifted and talented. These figures confirm the importance of differentiating between giftedness and talent. They overlap much less than we commonly think. Well, I could say much more about this differentiation, but time forces me to move on. Let's go to the fourth theme. It looks at the dynamics of talent development, and I will introduce it with a question. Why is there so little overlap between cognitive aptitudes and academic performance? The answer is simple, and the DMGT figure illustrates it very well. Individual differences in academic competencies result from the combined influence of four groups of factors: cognitive aptitudes, the G component, a long-term learning process, the component D, and the constant influence, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, of two groups of catalysts: intrapersonal and environmental, components I and E in the center. Note the arrows indicating the direction of these influences. These four causal components play different roles. Aptitudes serve as both the tools and the building blocks of academic talents. Here, cognitive aptitudes enable the acquisition of the knowledge and the skills specific to the various school subjects. Component D thus becomes the mediating agent between gifts and talents in the transformation of aptitudes into competencies. Its main subcomponent is investment. At the bottom, DI, namely engagement into the learning tasks in the form of attention, concentration, effort, and so forth. The I and E catalysts in the middle of the figure directly influence the developmental process and consequently the quantity and quality of learning. For example, a number of personal characteristics can influence the degree to which students are engaged in their studies, such as, well, their fluctuating level of interest for the various subject matters, the presence of personality disorders, their level of tenacity when facing obstacles, their degree of autonomy in the learning process, and their level of determination to bring their projects to full completion, and so on, many more. At the environmental level, the quality and pace of teaching, the classroom climate, parental support, and many other factors will help or hinder academic progress. Well, time does not permit me to explore these dynamics in greater detail, but my volume devotes 4 chapters to this subject. I hope that despite this brief overview, you realize the multiplicity and complexity of the developmental scenarios generated by these 5 components, with their 20 or so subcomponents and their countless facets. This has led me to summarize talent development as follows. Each talent results from unique and complex choreographies involving a multitude of interactions between all components and subcomponents of the DMGT. This sentence implies that all talents are equally valid regardless of the choreography followed. That is, even if this choreography does not include the presence of giftedness. Now, I had prepared 2 other themes around the DMGT, one on the role of genetics in the emergence of aptitudes and also personality characteristics, and the other on the importance of chance in the progression of talent. Few people beyond me talk about this subject, but time forced me to set them aside. So, as a closing comment for this more theoretical section, I have retained just one quote that, in some way, sums up these 2 themes. It comes from Professor Atkinson. All human accomplishments can be ascribed to 2 crucial throws of the dice, over which no individual exerts any personal control. A first roll of the dice determines an individual's heredity, and the other is formative environment. Note that the genetic background, which is unfortunately too often underestimated by professionals in the human sciences, will influence the elements within component G, aptitudes, and component I in professional catalysts, while the second roll of the dice will act on the elements of component E, environmental catalysts. So, if you have found yourself in the right place at the right time, remain modest, because in a significant way, you are simply the recipient of your gifts, your temperament, and your family environment. This concludes the first part of my talk. Okay, I needed a glass of water. Now we go on to the applied part of this presentation, implementing a real academic talent development program, or ATD. The first 2 themes of this second part will deal with the why of academic talent development, and the other 4 will describe the how, the modalities of implementation. I have chosen as my opening theme the first and most important law of all learning. Imagine any cohort of young students entering first grade. As you observe their school learning over the following months and years, you will observe 2 phenomena. First, all these students will progress in their mastery of the contents, meaning that the competencies of the group as a whole will grow fairly steadily month after month and year after year. In fact, school curricula have been designed to adjust more or less to the learning pace of average students. Second observation, Individual students will progress at different paces, some of them a little or a lot slower than average, and others a little or a lot faster than average. In short, there are very few truly average students. It is this dual phenomenon of group growth accompanied by significant individual differences that many researchers refer to as the first law of learning. Others call it the fan spread effect. This figure illustrates the fan spread effect. It shows, here it is, it shows school years horizontally and curriculum years vertically. First, the blue diagonal confirms the cohort's steady progression. One curriculum year for each year of schooling, more or less. After 8 years, most students have mastered, at least to some extent, the 8 years of the local curriculum. At the same time, the widening of the funnel that creates the fan spread effect illustrates the impact of individual differences and hence the dispersion of competence levels. The slower students, the pink zone, fall further and further behind the core of the cohort, and vice versa for the faster ones, the green zone. Note also the significant differences within each color subgroup. In the pink one, they range from slightly slower, 7 years of curriculum in 8 years of schooling, and or very slow, 4 years of curriculum in 8 years of schooling. And vice versa for the green group, where you can observe 8 years of curriculum in 7 years of schooling, going even very fast to 8 years of curriculum in 4 years of schooling. Note that the extreme values of this range show a 4-to-1 pace ratio. The fastest learners are twice as advanced as average, while the slowest learners have progressed twice as slowly. So there's a huge difference between the fastest and the slowest. I am sure that you can think of students whose progress is twice as slow as normal. For example, students who reach the normal age of entry for high school without having adequately mastered basic literacy and numeracy skills. These very slow learners do not go unnoticed. But you perhaps raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the possibility of a pathway twice as fast as normal. Completing primary school in 3 years instead of 6? For many of you, it does not make sense. Well, it does in reality. I know, for example, a few students here in my province of Quebec who went through the 11 years of the elementary and high school system in just 6 years, almost twice their regular pace. And there are many more like them in every country. Still, not as many as there should be. There are very few such prodigies in education because, as we will see, the school systems worldwide discourage accelerated progression. But if you consider that many more do so in arts and sports, it is clear that thousands of students around the world could do the same academically if given a chance. The next theme, the fan spread effect, looks great in theory, but we all know that the reality of our school systems is very different. For example, The green zone of the fan spread effect is virtually non-existent in any country. Why is this? Quite simply, because its manifestation is subject to one important condition. The learning pace must be open. In other words, there must be no barriers to individual progression. This allows each learner to progress at his or her own pace, whether fast or slow, thus maximizing the fan spread effect. Where do we find the best applications of the fan spread effect? You know, primarily in sports, where the development of the athlete's full potential is strongly encouraged and supported. It's also the case in the arts, particularly in music. That's why we see so often musical prodigies, young people who achieve a professional mastery of their instrument before reaching adolescence. This is another example of a pace at least twice as fast as the average. Well, open learning means no barriers on the pursuit of a maximum personal pace of learning. Yet, education systems the world over have been built around two main obstacles to its application. First, there is what we call the age grade lockstep norm. Almost all students advance 1 degree per year, whatever their spontaneous learning pace. In other words, the vast majority of students follow the diagonal of the figure. There are very few grade skippers and as few repeaters as possible. In Quebec, for example, the normal age grade lockstep affects 90% of elementary school children. 90% are just right on the diagonal, those who skip. And the remaining 10% is mostly made of repeaters. 9% of them. As for accelerants, most of the students in this meager 1% owe their advance to the Quebec program for early entrance at age 5 or 6. In summary, the fan spread effect, especially in its green part, is virtually non-existent. And yet, many thinkers, starting with Aristotle, have stated unequivocally there is no greater injustice than to treat unequal individuals equally. But that's what we do. And the age grade lockstep is compounded by a second blockage, which is the pace adopted by teachers in their classrooms. According to some US studies, teachers mainly adjust their pace to students performing at around the 40th percentile. Well, I've got it. 40th percentile. That is clearly below the group average. Why this slow pace? Well, it is to ensure the success, or should I say the lockstep progression, of as many students as possible. What happens to the students in the green zone, those whose learning pace is well above this average? I'm not just talking about the top 10% talented, but about the 20% to 30% of students who achieve well above average. This significant minority spends a large part of their time in class twiddling their thumbs, waiting for more. And what's more, they will waste even more time since they will only progress by 1 grade the following year. So, the absence of a true fan spread effect in educational systems around the world in no way signifies a lack of above average competencies. Rather, It means that our school systems do not offer learning conditions that are likely to create challenges and stimulate the students' motivation and volition. In so doing, they completely fail in their fundamental mission, which is to enable all their students to develop their full potential. Unfortunately, it is the talented students, those who make up our target clientele, who are the main victims. What a sad observation. In conclusion, if there is one fact that perfectly clarifies the why of an academic talent development program, it is not only this increasing spread of academic competencies over the months and years in all cohorts of students, but above all, the almost exclusive focus of teachers' interventions on students in the pink zone. How can we correct this profound inequity against talented students who are prevented from developing their full potential? The solution can only be systemic, given the sheer number of such students, and it must focus on group rather than individual clinical interventions. Indeed, the clinical approach can only offer a few drops of water in an ocean of needs. Now, the third theme brings us into the how. Let's start with the educational philosophy that would guide that program. It would be based on a profound respect for individual differences in learning pace, as manifested in the fan spread effect. I did not invent this fundamental principle. I found it in the writings of an American educational philosopher, the late Professor Elliot Eisner from Stanford University. Here is a short excerpt from his ideas on appropriate learning conditions for all students, including the neglected, talented students. First, the kind of schools we need would not hold as an ideal that all students get the same destinations at the same time. Individuals come into the world with different attitudes, and over the course of their lives, they develop different interests and proclivities. In an ideal approach to educational practice, each youngster would learn at an ideal rate. Over time, the cumulative gap between students would grow. Students would travel at their own optimum rates, and some would go faster than others in different areas of work. In this very short extract, we have a clear description of a fan spread effect perfectly applied to all learners, both the slow pinks and the fast greens. Let's now focus on our special group of talented students. How should we structure their school activities to help them develop their mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential, as stipulated in Article 29, quoted at the beginning of my talk? In a well-received article I published some years ago, I proposed 7 constituent elements of a true academic talent development program. For the purposes of this short presentation, I have selected the 4 most important ones. The first 2 focus on that program's curriculum. The other 2 on administrative modalities. So, my first constituent element is the keystone of this program. It targets the enrichment of the curriculum. I'm talking here about the regular curriculum offered in all local school systems. The concept of enrichment is similar to the fashionable and almost more politically correct concept of curriculum differentiation. But here, the term differentiation is imprecise. It has many different meanings because it covers all students with special needs. The term enrichment is much more relevant when applied to talented students because it identifies a type of differentiation specifically adapted to their rapid learning pace. I describe in that article 4 types of enrichment. By far, the most important is enrichment in density, also called condensation or compaction of the curriculum. It involves, you guessed it, accelerating the pace of content coverage across subject matters. Why give it priority over other forms of enrichment? Well, quite simply because it offers the most relevant response to the key characteristics of talented students, namely their ease and speed of learning. Did you know, for example, that almost half the students in a typical classroom can, on the very first day of the school year, pass with success the exam they will be given at the end of the year? Yeah, almost half of them. Of course, they will all improve their competencies over the course of the year, but do they really need 10 months to acquire the few unmastered competencies? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. Let me add that enrichment in density helps to correct the most acute problem that these students experience, their daily boredom caused by a teaching pace that is clearly too slow for them. Numerous evaluation studies have clearly demonstrated this sad phenomenon. The second constituent element flows directly from the first. It is based on the fact that talented students do not demonstrate their rapid learning pace episodically, but every single day, almost. Therefore, appropriate enrichment must provide intellectual challenges on a daily basis in all subjects taught. The concept of proximal zone of development proposed 40 years ago by Lev Vygotsky aptly reflects this necessity to keep students' learning pace at the cutting edge of their attitudes and interests. Now, let's go to the 2 administrative aspects. This need for constant curricular enrichment for pupils in the green zone will constitute a real challenge for teachers. And the challenge will grow over time as the competence gap within this group widens. And yet, this is a sine qua non condition for the full development of these students' potentialities. The widening of the gap is the proof of potentialities developed. Indeed, a wide range within the green zone will be the best proof that the school system has achieved its mission of developing the full potential of their students. Well, the challenge is quite different in the case of the slower students in the pink zone. Their difficult progress, often combined with behavioral problems, forces teachers to prioritize their needs. In other words, school systems consider far more important to minimize the size of the range in the pink zone than to increase it in the pink zone than to increase it in the green zone. Because of the pressure on teachers to minimize these slower students' failure, this is a very understandable decision. And anyway, it will be said that talented students will manage very well. Aren't they, in fact, far ahead from the average cohort and even further ahead from the less competent students? That is true, I admit. They achieve most of them, but will they actualize their full potential? The answer is no. And this choice of priorities very aptly describes the daily life in heterogeneous regular classrooms, not just here in Canada, but worldwide. More major evaluative studies, notably in the United States and Australia, have revealed that almost total absence in elementary classrooms of enrichment activities that specifically target talented students. There is none of that. So the conclusion is therefore inescapable. The pressures exerted by the less competent students of the pink zone leave no free time for teachers to plan and offer genuine enrichment in density. As Tom Cruise would say, mission impossible. Hence the third constituent of a true ATD, ability-based grouping. Is this an effective solution? Yes, without hesitation, as several studies have shown. But this effectiveness depends on one important condition: the regular presence of enrichment in density. Grouping is not an end in itself, just a means to a better enrichment. Ability grouping is also an efficient solution, as it allows schools to place in these groups specially trained teachers. And now we come to the fourth and final characteristics. It targets a set of administrative modalities whose virtues I have been proclaiming since my first years in the field of talent development. Think about it. How can we reconcile, on the one hand, the disparity in learning paces that the fan spread effect illustrates, and on the other, the age degree lockstep that the school system imposes on all its students? Well, the answer is school acceleration. It offers a perfect solution to this dilemma. The various accelerative modalities smoothly ensure the continuity of enrichment in density. Indeed, once talented students have mastered the current school year's curriculum, often several weeks, even months before the end of the school year, what could be more logical than to begin the following year's curriculum, rather than occupying the students' free time with various types of enrichment in diversity, totally unrelated to the curriculum and to the school program. In this sequence towards more advanced curriculum leads very quickly to a progression through the grades, which is, for example, grade skipping or merged grades, completing 2 grades in 2 years, for example. You may think that only a handful of students can benefit from an accelerated approach, but it is far from true. As an example, here is a question for you. A question I have asked dozens of times to groups of teachers in several countries. Imagine an elementary school system with 6 grade levels. How many of the students who enter grade 1 do you think could successfully complete this elementary curriculum in 5 years without any additional effort, simply by reducing the time lost? What percentage would be your choice? 10%? 20%? 30%? Well, the median answer I got year after year was around 25%. These were teachers in classrooms around the world who were answering this question. That's about 1 in 4 students. In short, a quarter of the school population loses at least a year in elementary school because of the age degree lockstep. Moreover, if that many students can save a year, how many of them would save a second year of lost time? Unfortunately, most accelerative measures meet with strong resistance from a majority of administrators, teachers, and even some parents. They ignore or refuse to accept the overwhelming scientific evidence in favor of all forms of accelerated enrichment. Professor James Borner, 30 years ago, elegantly summed up this conundrum when he asserted, acceleration is one of the strangest phenomena in the field of education. I can think of no other issue in which there is such a gulf between what research has revealed and what most practitioners believe. The research on acceleration is so uniformly positive, the benefits of appropriate acceleration so unequivocal that it is difficult to see how an educator could oppose it. Well, visit my website and you will find several downloadable documents on this little-known gem. Now, let me conclude this presentation with 9 testamentary bequests in the form of recommendations. First, aim to develop the full potential of every student. Always keep in mind that it is the fundamental mission of every educational system. 2, distinguish giftedness from talent. Remember that gifted and talented people make up at best only 20% of the population of gifted or talented people. 3, avoid the elitism of the top 2%. In our schools, many more young students than a meager 2% achieve excellence and demonstrate a need for faster progression than the average. 4, focus on talent. The science is clear. Excellence in current accomplishments is the best predictor of future success. 5, integrate all components. Between them, components D, I, and E exert a greater causal influence than giftedness alone on the emergence of academic talent. 6, maximize the fan spread effect. The regular progression of the group and the growth of individual differences sums up the first and most important law of all learning. The expansion of the fan spread effect is the best indicator of the maximum development of each learner's potential. 7, prioritize enrichment in density. This daily modification of the regular curriculum is the keystone of any true academic talent development program, as it perfectly meets the need for faster progression felt by a majority of talented and high-achieving students. 8, promote ability-based grouping. The homogeneous grouping of high achievers is the most effective and the most efficient administrative measure to ensure true enrichment in density. And finally, implement academic acceleration. Just like that early entrance to college mentioned by Jordan, which I just heard for a few minutes before speaking. So academic acceleration is an underrated administrative gem. It ensures the continuity of enrichment in density across grade levels. If you are curious to learn more, here are 2 suggestions: my website and emailing me. Sincere thanks for your attention. It was a pleasure.
Спасибо огромное. Dear Professor Gagné, thank you so much for your time and efforts. It was only 15 minutes, but the material we've received is just huge. And I'm sure that in the chat, although you don't read Russian, you can see a lot of pluses and these reactions, how huge, invaluable information that they've just received. You know, it's just an opportunity to touch something that's fully finished, like fundamentals, methodology, that is like a basis of all the models. Thank you so much for sharing these peculiarities. And I'm sure that we will need not one day, I think a few days to replay your lecture a few times, just to question ourselves, to try to build our own strategies of how to deal with our students on a daily basis, just to look at our students again through the prism of your model, and also look something important in each and every of our student, not what we want to see, but what we have in reality. And it's really great to use all the tools and mechanisms that you've suggested. Thank you so much, Professor Garnier, and we do have a few questions if you allow.
Yes, can I mention that I have given your organization, the SCLAD, a copy of the text that can be distributed to all the participants to the webinar and even to other people who are in.
Спасибо большое.
Yeah,
Да, это
thank
очень
you so
ценно.
much.
И мы,
We will make
правда,
sure to translate it into
вся и
Russian
все для
and
того,
even
чтобы
the
это
Kazakh
было услышано и
language.
увидеть как
We'll try
можно
at
большее
least,
количество
and make
педагогов,
sure that as many educators as
администраций,
possible can
школ,
learn
руководителей
about
образования,
your model. It's not
которые бы
actually not
могли
only
принять
educators, it's also
ситуацию, которая есть
administrative
сегодня на
people, you know, the
сегодняшний
managers of
поток.
schools, so that they could
Есть
change
такой
the educational
вопрос,
environment. So,
который
yeah,
мне хотелось
let's
бы
go to
озвучить
some
от
questions.
наших
We
участников.
do have a
Вот
few,
как модель,
just a
которую вы
second.
представили, дифференцированная модель, учитывает культурные различия, особенно
So the question
в
is, the
странах,
model,
где
your
концепция
model that you've
одаренности может
presented,
быть воспринята
how
иначе или
does
где
this
отсутствует
model
система для
includes
ее
the
поддержки.
component of cultural background? Because there are some countries we even have our speakers talking that in their countries, giftedness is considered to be alliterism or something like that. So is there any cultural component of applying your model?
If you look at the environmental component of the model, culture is one of these subcomponents. You know, there is family at the base, there is school, and there is the culture, and there is also the the laws and the principles applied by school programs in the country. So it just not culture is a very large and complex question. And I do not answer. I just say that if you want to maximize the development of the students' potentialities, well, your system must plan for this, the activities that will allow that. Just those I mentioned, like for example, you know, academic and enrichment in density and academic acceleration, things like that. And these should become part of the official school program in any school district or country or province or whatever.
Спасибо.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your
Уважаемый
answer.
профессор, следующий
Dear
вопрос у нас.
professor,
Какие
I'm just
инструменты
quoting a
оперативной,
question in the chat.
ежедневной
So, what are
диагностики
the
учащихся
instruments, what are
вы
the tools
считаете
of
наиболее эффективными?
everyday
И спасибо вам за основательную и
diagnosis of
интересный доклад.
students you think most effective? So, are there any tools that can be used on a daily basis by a teacher to identify students and diagnose them?
Teachers differ a lot between themselves. Some are very good at pinpointing, almost on the first day of the school year, a few students who are already showing that they are in the green zone, that they are thinking in an advanced way, that they are understanding rapidly, and that they love learning. So, I mean, when a teacher gets a new group, a new cohort of students, just the diversity of achievements should allow that person, I will say her because most teachers in grade schools are women, but she should already, through the academic documents that the child has in the school, have a good idea of those who are really rapid learners, because they have shown that. The most complex problem will be for those students which we mentioned in the beginning of my presentation as underachievers, those who might be very bright, but are not showing that because of all kinds of conditions, either in their personality inside them or in their environment or their past environment. So these will be a challenge for teachers to find them. And well, it varies so much. I could talk for hours about that, but we don't have time.
Спасибо большое.
Yes, thank you.
Мы
Thank you so
не
much.
будем вас задерживать, и
Yeah,
позвольте
we will not take any more of your time. I think we just need to rewatch your lecture again. I think it was quite a bold move to share your email address, because I'm afraid you will get a lot of emails after our webinar. But that was your choice.
I am retired. I do have more time. And I love to do that.
Спасибо большое
Yeah,
за эту
thank you so much.
возможность.
That
И
was
вот
just
те
a
вот
joke,
документы,
but yeah,
которые вы видите, они просто
huge
не
applause
единичные, а
for
множественные.
from
И
all of us to
спасибо
you.
вам
A
за
virtual
ваш вклад,
applause.
за ваш
Thank you
труд,
so much for
за
your
вашу модель,
heritage,
за
for
ваше
your
понимание, за
contribution
вашу
to this
мудрость.
huge,
Правда,
by this
спасибо.
huge
И
model. Thank you
мы
for
очень рады,
your,
если еще очень долгое время мы
again,
сможем
for this time spent with
переписываться,
us. And
обсуждать,
we
потому
hope
что
that
то, что вы
one
сегодня
day
нам представили
some participants from our webinar will be able to implement your tools and build a new generation of great learners and then great adults. And that's a real heritage that you've built. Like personally, for me, that's a really great experience. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being so well prepared for this meeting. Thank you for sending us this text as an additional material that we can send to our listeners today. And we are really honored to be with you today and to have a little touch with you with your talent. And I'm sure that your model have produced a huge number of gifted learners who were not identified as gifted before.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. And I wish you a lot of success in your future projects in Kazakhstan. Goodbye.
Спасибо. Всего доброго и здоровья.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Коллеги,
Bye-bye.
мы продолжаем. Это я неправильно сказала, что мы продолжаем. Я прошу поставить мне презентацию на экран. И хотела бы сказать, что мы с вами завершаем наш день, третий день, и им мы завершаем стажировку. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Мы завершаем первые два этапа нашей стажировки. Нас, конечно, ожидает еще третий этап. И у вас перед глазами все спикеры, которые были у нас за эти 3 дня. Мы благодарим каждого из них за тот труд, за то время, за то желание поделиться, за то, что они хотят сделать мир лучше, в том числе с помощью талантливых и одаренных детей.